Hi, Dr. Sam Dubé here once again for the Toronto Business Journal, and we are very fortunate to have with us here today Dr. Ivy Branin from New York City. Dr. Branin is a naturopath and the founder of Simplicity Health Associates website and the author of said blog as well. Ivy, thank you so much for visiting us today. We've had a conversation in the past, and that was a lot of fun. So I really welcome your insights and opinions today.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Now, just to contextualize this interview, we are at the beginning of March 2021, still during the COVID-19 pandemic. And statistically, and from what we're hearing, New York City, your locale, was among the hardest hit areas of the United States. And I want to get your insights into that. But just first, you're an intriguing individual, and I wanted to get a little bit of your background. So you mentioned to me that you actually have a background as a chemical engineer. Can you elaborate a little bit for us?
Sure. And to actually be even more specific, a biochemical engineer. The differences are subtle, but there are a little differences. And yes, I went to Rutgers University and I got my degree in biochemical engineering. And I've always been more of a left brain type of person, so always kind of much more geared towards math and science, though I also do love the humanities. And so I chose biochemical engineering. And when I graduated, there's so many different options as far as like where one finds himself with employment. And it's interesting. I think I even started developing some skepticism towards conventional medicine, actually, even towards the end of my years in undergrad. And so I did know that I wanted to work in pharmaceuticals. In fact, actually, even before I became a chemical engineer, I was a little bit considering whether to pursue a degree in pharmacy, actually. But I did choose biochemical engineering. And because, again, I was a little bit more getting a little bit more hesitant on conventional medicine, I felt that I wanted to work on a product that I felt would really help, and it wasn't going to be inhibiting anyone. And so my first company, I actually worked in vaccines. I worked for Wyeth, and I worked on pneumococcal vaccine. And I think sometimes there's kind of like a misconception of what engineers actually do. For the most part, engineers are not those that are actually creating products, but we're really the ones that step in and help to take a product and make it scalable and manufacturable. So when I was working in vaccines, I mostly worked on the fermentation end. So both looking at fermentation processes and then also the extraction of the, basically there's certain components of the bacteria that you extract, and you have to purify them to create the vaccine. I think that's probably enough of what most people would want to know about as far as like the vaccine. And then eventually I left my first company, and again, sort of wanting to work on pharmaceuticals that I felt were a no-brainer, like definitely a necessity. And so my second company, I worked on inhalable insulin. And at that time, I was doing more of what we call equipment validation. And so basically bringing in the specific equipment used for the production process and making sure that they are functioning optimally. And then also even looking at cleaning validation and cleaning processes. But to be honest, even I think even freshman year orientation though, unfortunately, this was did not really feel like the proper fit. But I guess I'm very, again, kind of being left brain and very practical. There's a lot of security in engineering specifically. As a woman, women in STEM do very, very well. And it's very true. There aren't too many undergrad degrees where one can just start working and make a really decent living with benefits. And so that was one of the big appeals of engineering, but you don't realize until you're actually in the field or working how important job satisfaction is. And it's interesting. as I talked to you, Sam, that like I also do interviews, and I'm interviewing someone in a few weeks who actually we went to high school together, and we kind of have a little bit of a similar story in that we both worked in corporate America, and because I still consider pharmaceuticals as corporate America, even as an engineer, and just sort of like the level of dissatisfaction, the long hours, putting in weekends, uh, not having, unfortunately, in America, we don't have that much vacation time. And even with our 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever the company allows, most companies don't allow you to take them all at once. And then I also, again, like I was becoming more and more skeptical about like, am I even really creating a difference? And basically how I even found out about naturopathic medicine is because of moving to my to work for my other company. I moved to Connecticut, and it was my neighbor actually who introduced me to homeopathy. And I had no, even though I was always sort of interested in natural healing and healthy living. I mean, I was a runner, as a marathon runner, and I really gravitated towards that kind of lifestyle. I didn't know a lot about these terms. And so I had never heard of homeopathy. I got a book from the library. I read it and I was like, that's it. That is what I meant to do. And I found this homeopath out in California who actually had been an electrical engineer, had gone to MIT. I called her up. We talked for like an hour. And she said, you're young. I was 25 at the time. You're single. You don't have all this baggage. Rather than going into a 1 to 2 year homeopathy program, which would be just a weekend here or there, you should really look into naturopathy. I didn't know anything about naturopathy either, but it turns out that Connecticut, not only is it one of the licensed states in the US, but there's actually a university there for naturopathy. So did a little bit more research. I picked the brain of some local naturopaths. At that time, the university in Connecticut, that program had only been around, I think, 7 years. So all the naturopaths said, if you can get into one of the West Coast schools, specifically Bastyr or National, which National has since changed its name, and I really should know the name, but I don't. They suggested that I go to one of those schools. And so I kind of a little bit of a leap of faith, because even after meeting with some naturopaths, I still didn't know the full extent of what I was getting myself into. But I applied, I got into Bastyr, which is where I went. I packed up everything. If it didn't fit in my car, it wasn't that important to me. I got rid of it, traveled cross country with a really good friend. We had a great time.
Hopefully you had a big car.
Toyota Camry.
It's a reliable car. It's a good car.
It was a good decision because, the life of a poor grad student and the life of a gainfully employed single engineer are very, very different. I really didn't need anything that I had. I ended up actually living in, it's total graduate lifestyle with a lot of UW students living in this. I think we had like 8 bedrooms. Sometimes like we had like 30 people living. So it would have not had been practical for me to take all those possessions. But honestly, if I was going to say, like, when you think about the different decisions one makes in their life, my decision to become a naturopath was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made.
That's fantastic. Ivy, I wanted to ask you, going from working as a biochemical engineer in the pharmaceutical industry, and in fact working on vaccines, which we'll get to a little bit later, and then transitioning to being a naturopath because it felt like it fit. How did you reconcile the approach of biochemistry and the idea behind the vaccines and the pharmaceutical industry's ideologies with that of naturopathy, which is the basic idea of naturopathy, if correct me if I'm wrong, is the body can heal itself if given the correct diet and environment and air and stress release, et cetera, rest, et cetera. How did you reconcile those two seemingly almost opposing ideologies?
What's funny, because I've actually found like they're not opposing at all. That's like kind of the crazy thing. And I'll have to say, like, working in New York City, which is unfortunately one of the unlicensed states, the fact that I have this engineering background and I have almost more of a scientific approach with my patients, I think has really helped me and really served me. One, because I've been able to establish really amazing relationships with a lot of medical doctors. And most of the time when they meet me, they're like, oh, this person's actually not a quack. They actually know what they're talking about. And they can really help my patients because at this point, I have nothing to offer the patient. So having them see someone like me, I can really help to fill in the gaps. But then also because naturopathy isn't that common in New York, and I'll have to say, like, I'm a big skeptic as well. Like, I'm a big, like, show me the proof. And that's very much like, if you can't prove it, most New Yorkers are not gonna buy it. They're not, don't sell them crystals, don't sell them anything too woo-woo out there. But I'm really, I mean, I don't, it almost is, if I were to say it this way, it might almost sound cold, but I look at like how I used to look at like fermentation processes and different manufacturing processes. I've converted that kind of methodology to looking at patients. And to say that like a patient comes in as a factory is kind of a strange way of looking at it. But like the big thing is, I'm always wondering, one, why is the person have what they have? What is going on in the body, and how can we best correct that? And by really having a good, clear methodology to come to these conclusions, and then because of my background, being able to, I'm a big PubMed geek, and for the most part, I really don't make any recommendations that don't have at least some scientific background. I mean, I wouldn't say that's across the board, but for the most part, I'm really looking up like to see, okay, so this person has X, what is going on? What are the systems that I need to address to get this person better? And what are the tools that I can use that will actually work? I'm a big proponent also of less is more. And one of the ways that you can really access less is more is being as specific and precise as possible, plus also seeing everything as a continuum of a process. So maybe the first step in this patient is to clearly address the adrenal glands or clearly address the digestion first. And then if you hit the right system, it's almost like a domino effect and everything else kind of falls into place. So it's really kind of like, one of the things we would talk about in clinic, naturopathic clinic, is like, what is the gravity of the case? What is the system or systems that are mostly effective? And so sometimes one might think, you have a gynecological case, you automatically are going to think uterus. But actually, that might not be at all. It could be something completely separate. It could be how the digestion is going, because we process all our hormones, one in our liver, but we also process a lot of our hormones in our digestive tract, in our small intestine, our large intestine. So if these are not working optimally, so I mean, it's been very interesting having patients come in, and I might take it in a completely different direction than they ever even thought that they were coming in for, because that's the true cause of what they have.
Well, now that you put it that way, I think what I was alluding to more was the ideology. That is, when you look at allopathic medicine, there is a tendency, like a knee jerk with a pharmaceutical agent as opposed to the approach that you're mentioning. But I think this isn't relegated only to naturopathy or even chiropractic, but I know many MDs, that's their approach. It's a more conservative approach. Like you said, they have a methodology, less is more. Especially when with regards to hormones, right? So you have someone who's diabetic. Do you just start giving them, insulin without modifying their diet, for instance? And I think there's a danger in allopathic medicine to rely more on the pharmaceutical aspect rather than looking at the person as a whole and trying to downplay or minimize the use of any of these, biochemical agents, and work with the body and work with the big columns of health, like diet and rest and stress release, and there's many other aspects, even like sleep, sleep hygiene, and so I think this is what I was alluding to a little bit more. But I can see now why, physicians do refer to you, because of your approach, and it is methodical, and you do have that, so-called classical science background, and you are very methodical in your approach. So now, that being said, can you, just to shift gears here for a moment, can you paint us a picture of what it was like, starting from the early months of COVID-19 in New York City, and then kind of develop that for us? So what did you see? What did you see in the community? What did you see amongst your patients?
So I guess sometimes I feel I hate to stick up for my city, but sometimes I feel that New York, this is within New York City, kind of got a lot of backlash that it didn't necessarily really deserve. And when we think about the nature of New York City and why it spread so quickly here. First of all, again, this is early on in the pandemic. We have 3 major airports that feed into New York City. Plus we have mass population. I mean, we're one of the most populated cities in the world. We have a 24-hour transit system. And again, when we think about early on February, March, when we really didn't know that much about, I mean, obviously we were seeing what was going on in China and we saw what was going on in Italy, but we didn't really have a lot of information on one, how do we prevent spread? And then also, in the treatment. So, having a huge spread and then a large number of cases that unfortunately, overwhelming the hospitals. And it is also interesting, sort of this kind of back and forth. I remember, because I used to live in Seattle.
Okay.
I had I forget if it was maybe it was in April or May, I can't remember. It was an article in the New Yorker about how Seattle did it better than us. Then a few months later, it was we were doing it better than them. And so again, I mean, I sometimes have to feel like I have to kind of, obviously, yes, there were things that we could have done better, but also hindsight is 2020.
Yeah, for sure.
But as far as it's so interesting because a lot of people were always wondering, am I seeing a lot of COVID, or am I having a lot of patients with COVID? And that actually I didn't really see so much initially, in the sense of, well, one, because the majority of my practice is much more geared towards women's health and women's health issues. So I really had a lot of more of the typical ongoing conditions that I normally see: women trying to get pregnant and difficulty with stopping birth control. But I guess the things, though, it's interesting though, if I was gonna say, though I didn't, in those initial months, not seeing so much about again, patients infected with COVID, but having the ramifications of lockdown. Lots of patients with tremendous anxiety. And actually, one of the things I love about my work, so I think we might have talked about this. I have a love-hate relationship with writing.
Yes.
But patients inspire me so much, and they're always giving me good ideas for new topics for blogs. So the things that I was really seeing mostly were patients with tremendous anxiety. Interestingly enough, I had a young patient, 25, who actually, because of sitting too long, damaged her coccyx.
Oh, wow.
And so we had to kind of work through that. And then again, if we think back to the stress and anxiety piece, and because I do work mostly with women's health concerns, women with terrible heavy cramps and periods and not getting their periods and periods all over the place, a lot of insomnia, sleep issues, headaches, couple things with that. So again, if we think about people now, one, working from home, not everyone has the best ergonomic setup. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a good desk, you don't have a good chair, So I also do Alexander technique. I don't do it for, I mean, I receive, and it was interesting because I actually interviewed my Alexander practitioner a few weeks ago, and we really talked a lot about like just like that hunching over and how much, you know, that's affecting not just like the tightness of the muscles, so that's going to be causing headaches, but also thinking about not having optimal respiration. Not having optimal respiration is also going to be causing headaches. Besides the ergonomic aspects, also just even the fact that now we're even more into our screens, and it's in a more pinpoint focused way than ever before. So if you think about back when, you know, people were working regular in offices and stuff like that, yes, you're constantly with the screen, you're typing and things like that, but you're not having that same kind of staring that one does now, having the Zoom calls and then
like we're doing now, yeah.
right, the Zoom calls and things like that. And so one of the things too is like the longer that you're so it's really important to like kind of look off into the distance because the eye strain itself can be causing the headaches. And then interestingly enough, do you have any doubts of that?
No, I was giving you my looking off into the distance with the duck face, of course.
Yeah. But something also that people don't realize is how toxic actually the air quality is in our homes. And there is this I don't know if they have the same term in Canada, but this idea of like sick building or sick building syndrome, and specifically when we're having more and more, and it's just like this it's cost benefit analysis of, so yes, having when having apartments and buildings that are more sealed are better from a kind of better from an environmental standpoint because, you know, you're not having to use as much fossil fuels and things to heat your homes, to cool down your homes, but you're not getting that proper healthy airflow. Right. And there have been studies actually really showing even just the act of cooking, even if you're cooking like a beautiful, healthy, organic meal, just the act of cooking does release toxic substances into the environment. And if you're not, you know, going outside, you're not having your windows open, these are all going to be contributing to the headaches. And then the other thing that I definitely have seen specifically in my practice and still seeing it is a lot of people got into a lot of like stress eating or like, you know, oh, screw it. Yes, I mean, interestingly enough, I have a patient. She was doing so well before the pandemic. She had Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, and we actually got her antibodies to normal.
Wow.
Partly from dietary changes and partly through some supplementation. Well, you know, pandemic happens, and she's like, ice cream makes me feel good. Not so much if you have thyroid antibodies. And so basically, it was almost as if the progress that we had made had no benefit at all. So I mean, definitely a lot of patients doing stress eating, things that they don't necessarily need. And then another big coping mechanism, unfortunately, and I mean, this is kind of always a battle that I'm always fighting with, which I never thought I was going to fight so much with, is because New Yorkers in general love to drink. Okay. And it seemed that this pandemic was even more of an excuse earlier on. And also looking at female hormonal issues. I mean, if you're a woman and you have any kind of hormonal imbalance, alcohol is like one of the worst things that you can be ingesting in your body for so many reasons. And so with a lot of women to deal and manage with the pandemic, or because it was almost as if like, what else am I going to do? I have nothing else to do. Let me just drink a bottle of wine. And so so it was a lot more looking at some of the lifestyle ramifications of COVID. And that was definitely earlier on.
Yes.
And now it's kind of interesting because now it's been sort of a little bit mixed because I mean, I'm still working with patients who, again, suffered from just being in lockdown. And now I have been working with quite a few patients with long haulers, which is basically patients that had pretty intense cases of COVID and now are having the ramification of the intense inflammation. So I have this poor woman who has terrible headaches, but we've actually really been able to help. And she was prescribed, oh my goodness, I think 3 or 4 different medications.
Wow.
And so now we've really helped her really wean off many of them and really kind of restoring her health. But and a young woman, not even 30 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. So I've been working now with a lot of patients with long haulers. And then one of my patients, unfortunately, who also not old, in her mid 30s, but she has history of asthma. Unfortunately, she caught COVID, and so really helping her to recoup. Because again, with COVID, it is more of a novel virus. And though yes, I have like a lot of antivirals and immune support, at this stage, I will help support my patients and I will help give them other things, but I'm very cautious as of making any blanket statements that you don't need to take this or that your medical doctor is prescribing. In fact, actually with this patient, it really made sense that she had to be on steroids. And it was one of these conversations that temporary steroid use, typically most patients are not going to have any problems. And I think sometimes like that can be a little bit of confusion because patients will be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get osteoporosis.
Right.
And that's not really the case for a 1-week course.
Blood sugar, raising blood sugar, changing their libido, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. So I think that's like one of the big education pieces I sometimes have to have with patients is that sometimes pharmaceuticals are necessary. And sometimes when we're thinking about like really bad adverse long-term effects, typically they're not necessarily always seen with very short-term brief use, and that they can be actually life-saving and really, really important.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly there's that aspect with certain psychiatric pharmaceuticals as well, getting people on that right track. Often depression is compared with, some people can function, but it's like being an 8-cylinder car functioning on 3 cylinders, you know what I mean, or 4 cylinders. So it becomes this tremendous effort to just get out of bed every day. And sometimes, a well-chosen, short duration pharmaceutical can just get them past that barrier, to take better care of themselves. So, I agree with you on that point. Now, you did mention some key points about diet, and I'd like to look at that for a moment here because I'd like our viewers to be able to hear more specific advice from you. And you mentioned about stress eating. And, we all have our comfort foods, right? And but are there any other points that you would like to mention regarding diet? What should be some things that people should be aware of, and what actions can they take to support their health and wellness through COVID, through lockdowns, through restrictions, using diet?
Sure. So, I mean, definitely when it comes to stress eating, and if you are someone who's like prone to stress eating, I mean, one of the most important things, and I mentioned this to patients, is actually making meals a priority. And because what happens often is patients will skip meals and they'll get more hungry, their blood sugar drops, and that's going to just make for poor decisions. And it's almost as if poor eating decisions lead to more poor eating decisions. So one, if you definitely are somebody who is prone to stress eating, of course, like, things are always happening, really making meals a priority. And like, this is always a big education piece and sometimes a hurdle I have with patients, because there's something about, and I don't know where this comes from, but it's almost like, I hate to say it, but sometimes there's almost like this aversion to self-care. And yes, in the beginning, it can feel like a chore, but once you start getting into a rhythm of it, it actually isn't that hard. So it could take maybe like 1 or 2 weeks to get into a rhythm. And so one, like when we think about making meals a priority, making balanced meals a priority. So again, we all get busy. I mean, I always have I try to always have my refrigerator stocked with vegetables, both fresh and frozen. I mean, yes, fresh can definitely be ideal, but but having some frozen vegetables are just as nutritious, and making sure that you're having them in hand. Because I mean, if I was only going to make one like nutritional recommendation to anyone, is making sure that you're having vegetables with most meals, even breakfast, really, is really, really important from like a nutrient vitamin standpoint, a fiber standpoint, making you feel more full, making you feel more regular, all our detoxification process. I always actually even encourage patients to reach more to vegetables than fruits. I mean, fruits obviously have health benefits as far as vitamins, but the unfortunate reality is that even though, yes, they're natural sugars, they tend to have a lot of sugar, and depending on the condition, sometimes it's not the best. And sometimes my patients are actually surprised that I actually tell them, oh, you should only be having 1 or 2 pieces of fruit, and ideally these. So really making sure that you have vegetables in place. Then the second component of again, like healthy meal planning, is making sure you have proteins. And so whether you're omnivorous, I'll usually suggest a balance. So not that you have to have animal protein at every meal, but a mixture of lean animal proteins, specifically trying to get fish in a few times a week, having some eggs, specifically the organic omega-3 eggs, and then having some plant-based proteins as well. And one of the things I also find that is very difficult is sometimes like the vegetarian diet and the vegan diet, people just assume that if they're following that, they're healthy, but you could also be eating bags of chips and cookies and cakes and things like that.
I can so you vegans who really don't eat well, but what did I want to say to you about? Yeah, I mean, are there any specific foods? Okay, you mentioned fish. I actually wanted to touch on that. Are there any specific types of fish that should be prioritized over others? Because we often talk about scavenger fish, like shale fish, and even tuna, high levels of mercury, and anything higher up on the food chain. Is that something that you also espouse, or?
Yeah, so it's definitely something that people need to be aware of, and it's very much the one thing is that it changes year by year as far as like different fish populations and which ones are better than others, and so I always have patients go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Safe Seafood Watch, and it's regional, and it will give you the most up to date of what is the cleanest. Now within, like when we're thinking about cleaner fish and like which ones to prioritize, those that are more oily, your omega-3 fatty acid fish, things like salmon, but of course, like everything is always, you have to, be mindful that for the most part, typically usually the Pacific Alaskan wild caught tends to be a safer option, but of course, everything you have to kind of be up to date. Some of your smaller oily fish, things like sardines, can be very, very beneficial. And also thinking about smaller fish tend to, because like they don't live as long, so they're not going to be accumulating. But I'll always steer patients towards looking at that, because I mean, definitely having too much methyl mercury obviously is not going to be helpful, both from patients trying to get pregnant, but other issues. Also, some fish having really high PCBs. But the big thing is, if possible, reaching for the cleanest fish that are high in omega-3s, because unfortunately, our diets are so high in omega-6s, which is very inflammatory. Even again, I'm seeing this more and more with my vegan patients. And the unfortunate reality is I mean, I'll work with any patient where they're at. And if it's coming from, I'm not going to say like, you have to eat meat if it's like against someone's religion. And we'll constantly have that dialogue. But I have, to be honest, over the years, have seen some conditions massively improve by letting go of a very strict vegan diet, even if it's just a couple of days a week, incorporating some animal protein. Which I call fish. I know some people don't call fish meat. I call fish meat. because it
Yeah,
is.
the
It's something,
the whole term pescatarian, right? Uh,
right.
so we talked a little bit about, vegetables and fruits and the consequence of, fruits containing a lot of fructose or sugar. And you talked about animal protein, and you talked about um, the fish adding animal protein in that form. Now, what about other fats? You talked about omega-3 fatty acids. What about other fats? Are there other types of fats that people should be concentrating on?
Yeah. So my favorite fats by far, I mean, definitely those that are rich in omega-3. So from a vegan standpoint, that would be flaxseed oil, hemp seed oil. It's also important to note what are what we call finishing oils. So oils that you would add to a salad or to a dish that's already cooked versus those that we would cook with. So that's always really important. So things like, for example, flaxseed and hemp seed oil, you wouldn't necessarily really cook with. I love it's a bit pricey, but I love walnut oil, specifically when it's delicious. It's a great finishing oil. Another oil product, which you can use culinary, Udo's makes some really good oils that are really delicious. So does Barleans, and you can both take them as a supplement, but you can also add them to salads and make dressings and things like that. Then from like the monosaturated, unsaturated fats, things like avocado oil,
Coconut?
oil. Huh?
Coconut?
So coconut oil is a good oil, well, specifically from like a cooking standpoint because it can endure a much higher temperature. I also like sesame oil, though, because with my work, it's very, again, specific to the patient. So it's also kind of like determining what oils make sense for them. So, because I have seen a lot, I like sesame oil a lot, but I also have a lot of patients that have sesame oil or sesame allergy.
Yeah, and I know for myself, like I used to consume a lot of coconut oil to the point of like scooping it into, blended drinks, and I just found it made me nauseous. I tend to get nauseous, so I use it far less, and I use it for cooking now more too. But speaking of specific patients, how, naturopaths tend to, in my experience, they tend to know more about food allergies and sensitivities, and that's like and combinations as well. That's a big part of their dietary approach. How were food allergies and sensitivities affected during COVID-19? Did
You
they
mean like,
worsen? Did they worsen? Did you see more cases of it because people were isolating and maybe not used to getting the food that they had available normally without the isolation? I mean, there were shelves that were bare, where I'm from. Did you find that? And I wanted to ask you the bigger question, like did the lockdowns, what did they lead to in terms of prevalence of disorders and things you saw in clinic or online? You talked about some female problems being exacerbated. So I'm asking you about dietary issues, and you talked about stress eating and such. But were there others? Did food sensitivities and allergies did more difficult to deal with?
it's interesting. Um, so one of the things that like, I'm like this big like bubble burster with my patients because anytime they say me, they're like, but, and I'm like, well, actually you can do this or you can do that. So, I mean, I'd say as far as like a higher prevalence, I mean, that one's a little bit tough for me to say. I mean, I definitely got a lot of new patients. And so whenever there's new patients, there is always usually the uncovering of, because again, looking at root cause. So the discovery of new food allergies. And then interestingly enough, sort of this idea around like, oh, will I be able to get
Yeah.
X, Y, and Z product? It's interesting because at the beginning of the pandemic, I had a few potential new patients,
Mhm.
and they all decided that they didn't want to go through with it because they were afraid that I was going to make some dietary changes, which I would have because that's what I do, and that they wouldn't be able to follow through with it.
Right.
And so, I mean, the reality is specifically, it's so funny because in some ways, yes, like the pandemic changed the way we do things here in New York, but then in some ways, not so much, and it kind of just highlight the way we do things all the time. Uh, though, yes, in New York, we have like, you name the store, we have it. Most New
Yeah.
Yorkers want everything delivered. So as far as like not being able to get access to products, I think there was like that initial fear. But then within, I think, a few weeks or whatever, it was really not the case at all. And I mean, when we have like places like, for example, Whole Foods, where you can get, I mean, you name the diet, you can even put in like paleo, vegan, whatever, and you can find a list of foods that you can have, and so you can easily access that. We also, here in New York, we even have some pretty, so one thing also I learned very early on in my practice, and I feel like I don't want to like diss New Yorkers, but something I was really surprised was that New Yorkers don't cook. I mean, I actually have some New Yorkers, some of my patients, they don't even if they wanted to cook, they just don't, they actually, some of them don't really even have kitchens. Like their kitchen is a microwave. So New Yorkers don't really cook. And so early on, when I started my practice, I really had to learn what are the healthy delivery meal options. And so in addition to some restaurants that cater towards specific food allergies that do deliver, and again, New Yorkers don't like to cook, they just want everything delivered, they just want seamless and Grubhub, make it really easy. And so a lot of those restaurants either completely converted over to delivery, or they just continued having the delivery. Like one of not too far from where my office is Who Kitchen, which is completely paleo. We also have Sweet Green. We have a lot of different restaurants that have like healthy options, and that's always been a big part anyway of my education with my patients, specifically those that don't cook or they don't want to bring their food to work. It's like, okay, where do you work? Great. So you have these 10 restaurants, and these are the best things for you to order from these restaurants. The other, so for patients that didn't even want to use any of those services, even though I'm not a big proponent of snacks in general, or a lot of snack foods, sometimes it's what we call harm reduction. So though ideally the patient wouldn't have these types of snack foods, but finding them like gluten-free, dairy-free, vegan, nut-free, whatever, grain-free options. One company or one online distributor that I like is Thrive Market, and they pretty much have everything that you could even think of, and they do delivery. And then we also have these different organic produce delivery programs. I actually use one myself called Misfits Market, and some of these, in addition to organic produce, also have like little marketplaces of, so for me, like I'll order, because I don't do dairy myself, and they have like a great array of different dairy-free alternative milk products and things like that. And so I'll stock up. So when I get my delivery every 2 weeks, I really stock up on those types of products for myself.
Now, what about the S word, supplementation? Because you and I were talking about this earlier about there really weren't major federal recommendations in the US regarding any supplementation that could be consumed in order to facilitate health and wellness during COVID, for lack of a better term. So we often talk about like zinc and vitamin D. Can you comment as to what your recommendations and or concerns are regarding supplementation?
Sure, absolutely. And so I think vitamin D is probably like the one that I think it's probably both vitamin D and vitamin zinc kind of got like the biggest news. So one of the things that, again, what I find is very difficult is for the lay consumer who, picks up some article but isn't that knowledgeable about all the facts and all the research. So vitamin D, yes, is very important specifically for immune function, but there's another side to that, is that mostly it's when we think about, there's different types of vitamins. We have water soluble and fat soluble. So vitamin D is one of our fat soluble vitamins. And some people actually prefer to even label it not so much as a vitamin, but actually as a hormone, interestingly enough. And so because vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin, means that we store it. And with any kind of fat soluble vitamin, because you store it, means you actually can overdose on it. And that could have some negative ramifications, unlike water soluble vitamins like vitamin C, where if you have too much, you just get an upset stomach and you have diarrhea and you're not going to be having any kind of problem. And it really seemed that with the research, and of course somebody watching this can always show me something different, and that's fine. But the research really was supporting that those that were deficient in vitamin D had a harder time with COVID. And so that's just like a really important thing to think about is this person deficient? And I tend to, when it comes to vitamin D, only make recommendations if there is a deficiency. Now that's always interesting too, is like, well, what's a deficiency?
Yeah.
So yes, like if you have your blood taken by a conventional doctor, as long as you're above 30, you're fine. But really for optimal health, I definitely recommend having blood levels above 50. And so typically if a patient is below 50, like between 30 and 50, typically I'll recommend anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 IUs depending on the time of the year. Because yes, we do get vitamin D from the sun, but there's a couple of caveats to that. One, if you're wearing sunscreen, it doesn't count. So you really can't wear sunscreen. And when I say you can't wear sunscreen, I'm not saying that you shouldn't wear sunscreen, but if you are wearing sunscreen and you're going outside and you think that you're absorbing vitamin D, unfortunately you're not. And so that's one thing. The other thing is where we are in latitudes. And I'm hoping I'm saying, so where we are distant from the equator.
Latitude is fat, so it goes around.
I know. I just like, I don't like to be like that doctor that says something wrong and then we're like, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. But depending where we are from the equator, we actually really don't absorb vitamin D in the winter months. And so overall, most people will need anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 during the winter months. So these are definitely things to really consider, that, again, that the research is really showing more that deficiency is associated. So sometimes, and this is always an education piece too, I have with my patients, because they'll see a bottle and be like, this has like 10,000 times the amount that I need. And so sometimes we prescribe nutrients for a therapeutic effect. And so we have to use very high dosages. And sometimes we do it for deficiency. And so there's a different methodology. So I find with vitamin D, it's very much to keep your levels above 50.
And I'm just trying to remember the American use. Was it nanograms per milliliter or something? I don't remember the exact unit. You have to excuse me, and I'll be the doctor messing up here.
So with the dosing, it's in international units.
No, that we know, that's common, but the measurement in the blood.
Oh, right, because I think there is a difference between.
There's a difference, yeah. But you know what? That being said, we can look this up. It's no problem. It's just that when I was a family medicine resident, my preceptor just said to me, Sam, just remember, if you test for vitamin D, pretty much everybody here is deficient. just remember that, okay? Pretty much everyone here is deficient. So you can recommend taking vitamin D without necessarily giving them the test. It generally won't hurt them, And so this is what I was told, not necessarily what I'm recommending, but it's just very interesting. And so you hear this a lot about vitamin D and having more serious symptoms and of COVID when you're deficient. And you're certainly not the first person to say this. What about and I think it's a really good point to mention the latitude, especially because that's often not considered, right? Like the sun is really low in the horizon where we are. You're in New York, I'm up in Ontario, so even farther north than you. But
and I wanted to just say one more thing about supplementation. So, because I have seen this in my practice, a lot of people take vitamin D wrong.
Okay.
If you're not using an oil emulsion preparation, because again, we're thinking fat soluble, you need to take that with a meal, and a meal that contains fat.
Is that true of all the fat soluble, like A and E as well? And
right, exactly.
K as well.
And then another thing is if you do use one of those oil emulsion formulas, which are, I often will prescribe the drops. Those drops go straight into your mouth. Do not put them in your glass because you're probably not getting, again, it's fat soluble, meaning, and if it's fat soluble, it is hydrophobic.
Yeah.
So that means it doesn't mix in water. And I have also seen patients waste so much money on vitamin D supplements that they weren't absorbing because they were putting it in water, which is really not a good way.
Yeah, it beads up and sometimes end up on the side of the glass, when you're, so that's a really good point. Actually, I've not heard anyone else say that.
No, it's important. Like, that's the thing. I mean, I get this all the time when patients say either this doesn't work, like something doesn't work. It's like, well, how are you taking it? It's really, really important.
That's a really good point. Zinc, can you give us your comments?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, zinc definitely is really important for immune function, and it has definitely shown to have, just in general, antiviral properties. I mean, so a couple of things about zinc. I mean, when we're thinking about prevention, I mean, most people just really need to be taking anywhere from 15 to 30 milligrams per day. And again, if we're thinking about a couple of things about zinc. So if you're someone who does have animal products in your diet, you might actually be getting enough zinc from your diet. One of the hard things is that the vegetarian diet doesn't always provide enough zinc, and not necessarily because the foods that one eats doesn't have zinc in it. But I have to say, of all like animals, humans have the worst digestive tract ever. And so we just aren't like terrible. Like, we need everything like pretty much pre-digested to digest anything. And the unfortunate reality is getting zinc from like nuts and seeds and beans and all these great things. We're not going to really be absorbing enough from them because of the phytates. And again, we have really bad digestive tracts. We don't have phytases in our bodies, so we're not really properly digesting them.
Unless the enzymes. You're saying we don't have the enzymes to break down the
right. So, I mean, there's workarounds. I mean, if you roast your nuts and seeds and grains, or you ferment them, you sprout them. But for the most part, if you are vegan or vegetarian, you might have to take some zinc. And then it's also important that minerals tend to be a little bit more finicky than vitamins, and a lot of them compete with one another. So typically, usually, better absorption happens when you're taking them away from food. But zinc makes people kind of feel a little bit queasy sometimes.
Yeah.
So if that is the case with you, having it with a little bit of like applesauce or a little bit of fruit tends not to affect absorption that much. But yes, a lot of zinc can make you feel a little bit nauseous or queasy. And then another thing you have to be careful with, and it's interesting because I'm going to be discussing this with the patient right after this, is copper. So if you are doing very, very high dosages of copper, so both of zinc, or actually it would be worked both the other way around too, is if you have too much zinc, you're going to be affecting copper. And interesting enough, and this is the conversation I'm going to be having with this patient after this, copper actually affects our ability to activate iron from ferritin, and so can cause low iron. And so these are all kinds of things. And also copper is so important for female reproduction. And so just kind of something else to kind of consider. I mean, I never want to say that patients or like that you can't supplement without a doctor or someone or an expert on your team, but you have to be careful because even again, like, first of all, one, it can be a complete waste of money if you're not taking things correctly. But all natural substances, or not all natural substances, are safe, and so you have to definitely be careful. But from a preventative standpoint, making sure again that you're having enough zinc. And again, most of the studies too, kind of similar to the vitamin D, it's not necessarily that people taking supersonic dosages of zinc, to fight off COVID, but more, again, looking at deficiency.
Right. Now, what is your take on zinc consumption and male versus female? Is there any difference there at all? Because, you often hear that, zinc is so important in male reproduction. And so men should be more wary of the amount of zinc they consume and consume more, in fact. Is that something that you can comment on? Is that true? Is that?
No, it's actually important for both female and male reproduction. I mean, definitely like male when we think about healthy sperm production, but then it's also very important for women. I mean, really the big difference again in dosaging is women tend to be smaller than men. And so there's going to be different requirements. And then also if a woman is pregnant or lactating, also the recommendation as far as meeting the daily requirement would also change.
There are certain biochemical differences between the biological sexes as well. You often hear that men need to take more DHA for their omega fatty acids than EPA, right? So women can take EPA and they can do the conversion more efficiently to DHA. And DHA is the brain food and EPA is the body food, et cetera, right? So what I wanted to comment on was there any other supplements that you would prioritize for people at this time?
For prevention or for?
Let's say facilitating health and wellness during this trying time.
Sure. So I get this question a lot. So like just from
I'm not original.
From the basic standpoint, most people would benefit from a high quality multi, whether even if you're eating 100% organic, you're probably still not getting enough nutrients for so many reasons. One, because our digestion stinks. Yeah. And our soil's terrible. So a high quality multi, what does that look like? One that has methylated B vitamins. Why methylated? Because about 10 to 15% of the population is deficient in an enzyme that basically activates folate. If we don't have activated folate, we're not going to be having methylation, and then you have a whole other kind of issues, and that could be a whole other conversation. So making sure that you're having a high quality multi that is has methylated Bs. And how do you know it has methylated Bs? The B vitamins will say like methylfolate,
right.
Methylcobalamin. So it will say methylated. I tend to also recommend not having iron in the multi. I don't know why a lot of companies put iron. It's not to say that you shouldn't take iron, but iron basically messes up with the absorption of so many nutrients. Iron should always be taken away from everything else. So definitely one that does not have iron. And then I tend to like ones that have as low amount of fillers. So typically in my practice, I usually will recommend, I like pure encapsulations for my patients because again, they tend not to put a lot of other things in it. Because I've even seen, I know sometimes like patients will want, or like what they call like whole foods or like food-based multis. I sometimes can find them can be problematic, specifically for anyone who definitely has food allergies. The nutrient percentages sometimes can be a little bit unreliable. Probably some people watching this are going to be like, that's not true, and that's fine. But that's just from what my experience is. So it's a multi. Definitely a probiotic is really important. And I think specifically now because of quarantine and lockdown, we're just not getting enough microbes, both from not being around people and so much hand washing and using of antimicrobial products. And oh my goodness, I mean, the microbiome is so important for immune function. So making sure you have a good quality probiotic for women in particular, making sure that your probiotic has Lactobacillus reuteri and rhamnosus, because those are really important for the female vaginal microbiome, which if that gets out of whack, all kinds of problems. We're talking about chronic UTIs, we're talking about HPV infections, we're talking about recurrent bacterial infections. So really important to make sure that those are in place. And also even for women who are pregnant, having those bacteria in place can help to prevent group B strep, so important. And then lastly, definitely a good fish oil. I actually usually will recommend cod liver oil. The reason being is that it naturally already has the vitamin D and vitamin A, which are really important for immune function. So those are definitely the most important. And then most people, again, because we live in a very toxic world, and specifically here in New York, because patients love to drink, or we all like to drink, having really good liver support can be really important, and for women. And then in some cases, depending on the age of the patient and where they're at, specifically when it comes to menopause, a lot of patients might need a good calcium supplement.
Okay, just to go back to a couple of things. What form of zinc would you recommend? Zinc citrate, aspartate? What form would be most efficient or bioavailable, or that you recommend to your patients?
I typically usually recommend the picolinate form.
Picolinate, okay. And then with your focus on women's health and iron deficiency anemia being so common among women, what form of iron would you recommend? Would you recommend heme iron? I had heard talk about how heme iron can really increase inflammation, and you know as well as I do that high ferritin can be an indicator of it's an acute phase reactant. It can be an indicator of inflammation elsewhere in the body. That being said, then are there better types of iron than others that get more readily absorbed, maybe too absorbed, interfering too much with the absorption of other nutrients? What would you recommend for iron, and specifically for women? What would you recommend?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, definitely I would never prescribe iron unless I knew that they were definitely deficient. That's like 100%.
Okay.
And, you know, for women specifically, having levels of about 70 is ideal, blood level of ferritin when it comes to optimal functioning. Specifically, women don't like losing their hair, and I find that you can't really restore hair growth with values under 70.
But what's the normal range for you in the American units? I'm not sure what the American units are, but they're sounding familiar here, like because I know my ferritin, and it would be in keeping with what you're talking about there. Okay, yeah, we should have thought about this, eh?
Next time or something, or maybe we'll put that in the comment section as translation of the. So I definitely want my women to have at least 70, and so if a woman is not optimal but she's still in the normal range, I mean, mostly, hopefully, as long as she's not vegetarian, she might be able to get that from diet. Maybe increasing more animal products, being careful of if she's having a lot of dairy products or taking a calcium supplement, for example, making sure that is not taken with like iron-rich foods, because that's just going to affect the absorption of iron. That's one of the reasons actually why many children are deficient in iron, because kids love cheese, but they don't like meat. So having a lot of calcium-rich products, though, is optimal for bone health, and not so optimal when it comes to iron absorption. So ideally, definitely always, if I'm able to, improving it through diet. And when it comes to non-heme versus heme, the reality is heme is more bioavailable. The workaround with non-heme is having vitamin C rich foods with if one is trying to get that from the diet. But most in my practice, so because my practice is very nuanced and it's tailored to the patient. I mean, there's a bunch of different iron supplements I use, and it really depends on the sensitivity of the patient. Because one of the biggest complaints, nobody likes to take iron. I find like that is like the hardest one, and I kind of like, honestly, if patients just started eating a little bit more meat, we wouldn't have to have this issue. But unfortunately, that is reality, but a lot of patients do not tolerate iron so well. Ones I definitely find, there's a company called Vitanica, and they have what's called Iron Extra, and it has 500 milligrams of vitamin C, which not only does it help with absorption, but it's also going to help prevent the constipation type side effects, because it has some herbs. I often will sometimes, like for a very sensitive patient though, one of the things I haven't found, so Floradix tends to be well tolerated, but it just doesn't always do the best job. But then this other product that one of my patients actually introduced me to, it's Pranin, which is a vegetarian source iron, does seem to work very, very well without having any kind of GI side effects.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of GI, another supplement you and I discussed before the interview was probiotics.
Yes. So as I mentioned before, that definitely probiotics are really important, and specifically women, making sure definitely to have one that includes reuteri and
Yes.
rhamnosus. So very, very important. And I gut health is one of my favorite topics, and,
Yes.
and I love talking about probiotics and fermented foods, and almost like I feel like almost every single health condition can be improved by probiotics. And I mean, definitely probiotics, I don't think will ever be a standalone per se, but when we're thinking about one, immunity, how important that is when it comes, making sure again that we have like the proper bacteria in place for our immune function. I mean, our guts in general just produce, that's one of the centers of our immune system is actually in our gut. But then also thinking about probiotics are just amazing because even when we think about even immune function, so immunity, or when we think about the immune system, it's almost like you have like two different, you have like the positive side, like you have like, it's almost like Star Wars, like the dark side and the light side. And so like the light side obviously is like, we want to have a robust immune system to fight off the things that we don't want. But then the problem is that sometimes our immune system continues fighting, and that's kind of like what we're seeing with like long haulers. Or then we see the other side again of our immune system misinterpreting things as foreign that it doesn't have to, like, and that's when we think about autoimmune conditions or allergies. And there's been so much interesting research specifically looking at rheumatoid arthritis and how different the gut bacteria composition, and how some bacteria seem to be either non-existent or in much lower numbers than in comparison with those that don't have rheumatoid arthritis, and how the benefit of adding probiotics can be in basically shifting the inflammation profile.
I'm really glad that you expanded your comments about probiotics. That's what I was hoping that you would do, and also probiotics and mood.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you
Yes.
comment?
I mean, when we think
Especially
about
the lockdowns and everything.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you start probiotics today, it's not going to make you feel happy today. But when we think about how the gut has like another name, or we think about like the second brain, and it's because one, a lot of the bacteria, we actually produce more serotonin, which is one of our neurotransmitters in our gut. Our brain communicates with our gut, but also our gut communicates with our brain. The composition of the bacteria in our gut also can really determine how we react to stress. And I often really look at most mood disorders as a disarrangement in stress response. And I'm really mostly looking at very often the HPA axis, and how much, again, if the fact that like our gut microbiome has an effect on how we relate to stress. When people are under stress, there are those feelings of anxiety and feelings of depression. So it's really important to look at that.
You mentioned microbes and the fact that we get, exposure to microbes from other people. And, I believe we're tribal, right? We're tribal and we evolved this way. And so we evolved to live together. And one thing the lockdown has done is, like I live alone, right? So it's like during lockdown, it's like my contact with other people is extremely, extremely limited. And, I didn't hug my own mother who lives 10 minutes from me. I didn't hug her since last February.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and that's, she's not much of a hugger, but that's a tough one. You know what I mean? Like, so, with regards to microbes, you and I discussed this very briefly, and I posed this question to you. Given all the sanitary protocols and the lockdowns and the isolation, and not only that, but just raising children in the modern age, are we weakening the human race?
I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the backlash is. I wouldn't be surprised if, again, I mean, I don't know how much like 1 year of this would have an impact, but I mean, I'm foreseeing that some people will be, I don't want to say stuck in this realm, but just because of some of the psychological ramifications of fear of contaminations from others, that there are some people that will kind of potentially live more of this like hermetic style life and really almost kind of like a Howard Hughes kind of existence. And so depending on how long this style goes, I mean, it really could have, we might be seeing a big surge in autoimmune conditions, which I mean, which is already rampant. We might see also an uptick in allergies. And it's interesting because like when we think about COVID, how it affects respiration, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see a big uptick in asthma. I don't know how soon this will happen, but I would not be surprised that we see that there's going to be some definite long-term effects to COVID that have, I don't want to say have nothing to do with COVID, but they weren't even directly caused by COVID, right, but the situation that COVID caused us to live in, depending on, again, how long we are in this state.
Right. And so for the viewers out there, Ivy and I are referring to the hygiene theory of immunity and the ramifications of living in this type of environment, and you know, with the lockdowns and you know, the Purell, you know, I mean, even when I worked in the hospital, I was washing my hands 30 times a day minimum, and I was lucky because minimum, yeah, and I didn't break out. But a lot of people, especially the young women with very soft hands, my hands are just rough from years of training, but you know, their hands were terrible dryness and breakouts and things, you know, from being sanitary, right? From being sanitary. I want to touch on a few more things that you mentioned in your blog that I think really attest to your holistic approach, and as your status as a naturopath and primary healthcare practitioner. You mentioned something about dedicating time to making meals and really putting some thought into that, and how New Yorkers, you know, their kitchen is a microwave and that sort of thing. But let's expand that to the idea of structure. What is structure, and how can that contribute to your health and well-being?
Well, definitely, like, structure really kind of keeps us safe. And one of the things, like, I mean, I'm not a parent, and I probably will never be one, but one of the things when we, like, if we think about small children, that they actually really need structure. This idea of like, oh, just letting kids run wild and free actually makes them feel unsafe. And similarly, as adults, we need structure. And one, it creates sort of a normalcy. And I mean, yes, we're kind of living in very unusual situations, but I mean, this is really not the time to just like allow everything to kind of fall apart. And I'll have to say, even from my own personal like journey with living during COVID, the first week, it was a complete, I don't want to say complete disaster in my, but you know, everything kind of was, and I was like, I realized after a week, I'm like, no, I have to kind of get back on, like, yes, I'm not leaving my house anymore. Yes, I'm not commuting to the office. I'm not doing, and what has been amazing, how many things and how quickly some of the things that we were doing pre-COVID converted themselves over to the virtual medium. And from my own kind of like, again, like thinking my own health, self-care structure, a big part of my mental health and my fitness is ballet. And so that was actually a big part of my pre-pandemic structure. And what's great now is that my teacher being virtual. So it's like, even though does my day to day look exactly like how it did before the pandemic? No, but it still has like a rhythm of like, I get up still relatively around the same time. I do I have like a morning start, like a little bit of prayer, meditation, really to set the day. I'm lucky. I have a women's group, and we kind of like talk about business, and we talk, and then rolling into ballet, and then seeing my patients, and I think one of the other important parts about also making sure again that something I have seen definitely with a lot of my patients, unfortunately, some people are actually working more than they were before the pandemic because there isn't this like barrier or this dividing line of when work begins and ends. And so really, as much as, the unfortunate thing is when you're working for someone else, sometimes you don't necessarily have that luxury, but finding ways of really separating. Even when we think about like, again, structure also has to do like, creating space within, as New Yorkers, we live in these tiny boxes, but like, this is my work area. This is my where I eat. This is where I sleep. This is where I do some of my fitness or whatever that looks like, but really making sure to build in these things. And if one is able to kind of actually building things from the supportive mechanisms first, which is healthy meal time for some sort of mindfulness practice, even if it's only 5 minutes, time for some sort of physical activity. Even if you're somebody who's not into like conventional exercise, even if it's just like getting outside for a 20 to 30 minute walk, building that in, and then having in place in that structure of an unwinding ritual.
So that's really funny. You mentioned the other two things that I wanted to address, mindfulness and exercise, and you touched on the exercise with your own ballet experience. I just wanted to comment that I found, I was doing a fair amount of athletic coaching in person, and then when we hit COVID, I tried to transition to online, and I just found, there are certain benefits, obviously, to going online. One is the social distancing, obviously, but there are some other ones that are maybe a little bit less tangible when it comes to the actual teaching experience. But overall, maybe I'm of that generation where, we grew up playing outside until the sun set, and our parents would call us in for dinner, and then as soon as we're done dinner, we're back outside again and rolling around in the dirt and the crap and the feces and whatever, and building up our immunity from the hygiene theory of immunity and whatever, and climbing up trees and falling out of them. And, video games didn't figure very prominently. Computers didn't figure very prominently back then. If you're lucky, you had a Walkman with a cassette. And so I think maybe I'm of that generation where the whole virtual thing really is that virtual. It just doesn't feel real. Even when I went back to school and I studied medicine, we were studying off laptops. I'm like, I can't do this. I can't study off a laptop. I got to print everything out, if at all, And I think, did you see that in your practice at all among people who are, let's just say, a little more mature, the difficulty in dealing with the online aspect of communication and interaction and relationships that really came to the fore during COVID? It's not like we didn't have a choice, right? So did you see any ramifications of that in your practice or personally?
You mean like adjusting to using?
Yeah, adjusting and not adjusting well, or and I'm not talking about, not being a tech savvy person. I'm just saying, it's different. Like even this interview is so different, right? It's like, it would be so nice to have you in a studio or in my living room and us just chatting and sharing some tea, and some vegan cookies or whatever, and being able to, because there's so many more cues, right? And like right now, you're a little box to me, two-dimensional. Right. And I know you're in New York and I'm up in Ottawa, and okay, yeah, speed of light, this is near instantaneous. But at the same time, we are tribal people, and we have all these senses that I think need to be stimulated. But all I was commenting on is that younger people, I find they adapt more readily to this. So for instance, texting. I hate texting. I can't stand texting. I'd be lucky if I can get 10% of what I want to say across in a text, right? And then there's that whole subcultural, sublinguistic thing going on there with the emojis and all that going on. But, even talking on the phone, I find impersonal, and to resort to texting and messaging, like, oh, man, that's anathema, right? So I'm just asking, like, do you find that this is affecting people as well, their mental health, their mood, not being able to, some people say, oh, no, it's good, I'm good, like, I'm good virtual, everything's fine. And I'm like, no, it's not fine. It's not.
Well, I found like, just like anything else, I mean, it's a spectrum, there's a mix. Because my practice, for whatever reason, and maybe it's interesting because I've been thinking about that actually, like, why is it that these patients are coming to me? But for the most part during the pandemic, a lot of my newer patients have all been of sort of like the under 30 range. And I think that they've always been more acclimated to gadgets. Like, I mean, I obviously now, like, I mean, I'm very versed on social media, but I didn't grow up with social media. And so for some of those types of patients, well, I think it's also mixed. So I think as far as like adapting to the technology and everything, that I think has been not so difficult for them. But what I think what has, and it's interesting because, like, again, I think I've been mentioning that I do interviews myself. And I had an interview with a psychologist who works a lot more with younger adults. And one of the big issues that we both were experiencing is that, and this may actually be a little bit off topic,
Go ahead,
but
please.
I think it's relevant, is that some of these young adults, it was like, they were finally going to be independent. And then the rug was pulled up, whether, they were going to start university or they were starting their career job. And now if they started their career job, they actually lost that position, they're living at home. And even if they didn't lose the position, they're living at home. College kids really being robbed of, I mean, when we think about the college experience, it's not just about going to class and learning the subject and studying. It is about building those relationships, how does one do that in the virtual? So that definitely, and then even like, how does one, it's a little bit different, I think, in Canada, but unfortunately in the US, higher education is extremely expensive. Even if you are going to a public university, a lot of people are generating a lot of debt. So like, is it worth it to spend 30 grand a year to sit behind a computer? I don't know. So I think that that is like one issue. But then, and the other though, I have seen this not just in my practice, but with some of my colleagues and some people that I associate with, is one of the benefits though of right now is the ability to slow down, the ability to actually better curate one's life. So maybe specifically, I think in New York, a lot of people are always doing things. There's this tendency of like, oh, like when you go out to a meal with friends, it's not enough just to go out to dinner with them. You also need to be going to a comedy show after, and then meeting, and then having a first date with someone. That's like kind of like more the typical, but now we're having more of this curated life, and like one can really start reflecting how important is this relationship or this endeavor. And then some people kind of like rediscovering hobbies that they haven't been using, people reading. So it's definitely very mixed. And really, I think depends on, and then I've actually even had some patients that have actually flourished during the pandemic, specifically some of my patients that are much more on the introverted or the highly sensitive spectrum, the fact that they actually have minimal interactions with people and it's like on their own time, they can actually turn off the screen, they're doing a lot better. So it is very interesting.
Speaking of, the approach and mental and mood health, mindfulness, are there any particular mindfulness techniques that you would recommend?
Sure. So I always tell patients the best mindfulness technique that you can do is one that you can be consistent with, because really mindfulness only works when it is consistent. So the idea of going on doing a 3-hour meditation in a retreat or something, the long-term benefits of that practice is probably not going to be so much. So really what someone can really stick to. But what I have found in my practice is sometimes, though I myself, I do meditate every day, meditation can be a little bit difficult for people in the beginning. I think, well, one, there's so much misconception about what meditation is, or this idea that like, oh, I'm not good at it, or I can't be good at it, when that's, again, it's a daily consistent practice. Nobody goes to the gym and then leaves with 6-pack abs. It just doesn't really work that way. But so with that, like I find is that breath work tends to be the best for somebody just getting started. I think because it's sort of an active practice. Patients can really, they're counting, and also because most breath practice have at least some immediate results that sometimes meditation, I have found, again, for patients just starting out with meditation. Of course, like, I'm not saying that no one should try meditation. I love meditation, but it can be kind of like a stressful, anxiety-producing activity where breath work, on the other hand, tends to not have that same effect. That being said, whenever I am teaching, I teach a couple of different breath work techniques with patients. I tell them that this is more of a preventative, and that they really should be practicing it, and that they can use it in times of stress or anxiety. But if their first time using the breath work is during that stress or anxiety, it's probably going to make it worse, because they're going to be like, wait, what was the technique? I mean, this is a whole, but like, no, like, it's better that you have like familiarized yourself. I think that's the thing we talk about a lot, like in mindfulness, is like familiarity. So like familiarizing yourself with that practice. But other types of mindfulness, I mean, one of the things that I think most of us are really guilty of is multitasking, which it seems like it's a really great way to get so many things done. But if we're actually able to bring more of like this idea of like monotasking, almost anything can actually become a mindfulness practice. Like if we're really committing to, for this next 10 minutes, I'm just washing the dishes, and I'm like feeling the water, and I'm noticing the bubbles as they're building up. I'm really like scrubbing the dishes. Or eating can be a mindfulness activity of like feeling the smelling, the sensing, really being present, where you're not eating and doing work. And I do it. I totally eat and do work. It happens. But it's interesting for myself, even these days where I really commit to sort of a monotasking approach, how much more calm answers just seem to like come to me. It's like almost like I developed this like sixth sense in a way.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Brian Tracy's recommendation for silence, just going and sitting and doing nothing. Mm-hmm. And he said, do it when you feel you just don't have the time or the inclination to do it. That's when you need to do it the most. Mm. This is what I tell people about exercise. It's when you feel you don't have the time or the inclination to exercise is when you need to exercise the most. So I feel that about exercise and silence. Now I know you have to go soon, so I just want to touch on a couple more points. You've been awesome. Thank you so much, Ivy. You mentioned project time in your blogs. Can you comment? Project time, making time.
What project?
Yeah, project. Sorry, project.
Tomato.
Yeah. So attacking a new endeavor in like whatever that may be. Can you comment to that, and how COVID may be an ideal time for that?
Oh, and well, I mean, having a project is so great in so many ways. I mean, one, specifically if it's a project where it's causing creativity. I feel like it's almost like a healthy distraction, because there's so much on the news now, everything. And yes, one needs to be aware. I'm not necessarily saying that we need to live in a bubble, but when we have a project, it kind of gives us like a motivating factor and something that will really focus our intention. And again, it could be even something that either it's a skill or a hobby that we've always wanted to do, or it could be something maybe from our childhood, something that we've like abandoned because of work or things got too busy. But when we think about different neurotransmitters, dopamine, when we've accomplished something, we get like a big hit of, it's the same reason why we love to like post something on Facebook, to get those likes. Every time we get those likes, we get a little bit of like the dopamine, and there's something, that feeling of accomplishment that you've done. And a project can even just be like cleaning out your closet, or I
Don't tell me that, though.
I love cleaning and organizing. Like that's like one of my favorite things that I can like geek out on. Like what kind of new thing can I do? It could be building something. It doesn't necessarily have to be something like considered. I don't want to say anything is impractical, but it could be like that piece of IKEA furniture that's been in the box for like 3 years that you haven't bothered to like open it up and build it. There's something very satisfying about like finishing that project, but then even being in the process with it and really giving yourself full attention to the details.
What lessons would you like your patients, yourself, everyone to have learned about health and wellness over COVID?
Really, when we think about like investment, how important it is to invest in oneself and having those things, like when we think about like having like a preparation plan, like a disaster plan, or really having like a good, like solid self-care plan. And actually, if we're doing self-care now, and like that is just part of our practice, that we're always doing it, we're just going to be better prepared to handle these things. I mean, if you like, there is something so different about somebody who has built in, for example, a practice of daily meditation, whether again it's like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, the reaction time, the way that they are going to take on all that is going on, versus somebody who's like hasn't been doing that all. Like, and when we think about like this idea of resilience and how we can build up resilience through exercise, eating healthy foods. I mean, when you have these, and it's not, and I don't want to say that people that already have like healthy lifestyle in place don't fall, and that we don't like, I eat chocolate like everyone else, and I definitely like sweets, but having enough to come back to really to taking care of ourselves. And again, like not to, and I think we talked about this a little bit before we went on, like I don't want to demonize anyone and saying, oh, like you deserve to get COVID, for example, but it is really important. Unfortunately, a lot of the pre-existing conditions that made getting COVID so terrible, a lot of these chronic diseases actually are a factor of poor lifestyle choices in many cases. Again, I'm not saying this is a blanketed statement, and I'm not trying to place blame, but I'm hoping that if anything, it's just like an eye-opener of how important it is to take care of oneself. And then again, I sometimes can be like a Pollyanna, and like I don't want to be like, again, like these are really kind of crazy times, but even with the pandemic, like finding ways of joy. I mean, some of us, again, yes, there's been so much disconnection because we're not interacting directly, but what's so amazing during this time is the reconnection. I find specifically early on, like some of my friends in Europe, like reconnecting some of these friendships, like that and being able to actually see them more. I myself too, like finding like some of my familial relationships are stronger than they ever were before. So really finding that, yes, there's so much darkness, but that there can also even be light within the darkness. And also, if you're somebody who has really tapped into that light, using that as a vehicle of really being of service to others, and really perhaps like calling someone that you haven't talked to who you think might be suffering and offering some sort of support. I mean, I'm very lucky, again, living in New York, even though, yes, we're not really seeing each other directly all the time, but it's interesting, even some of like the little neighborhood things. I had like a little indirect book drop off with a friend of mine, and I would drop off books by her and she would drop them off by me. And even though we didn't see each other, there was something about opening up this book and thinking, oh, like while I'm reading this book that really had some meaning to Rivka, she's reading some of the books that really have meaning to me, and being able to share that with someone else.
I wanted to ask you your perspective on what's happening now with the distribution of the various vaccines, what you think of the emergency use order. We could have an entire interview just based on that for sure. But do you have any comments you'd like to share with our viewers before we wrap up?
Well, I mean, I think the one thing is, and I think like some people have different opinions, or they feel, of course, like anything else, like everybody thinks things should be done a different way. But really, when it comes to the vaccine and what we know now, and how the vaccines currently function, of course, tomorrow we might have new research. So I'm just basically saying from what I know today and what the research shows today, that these vaccines, their main function is to help prevent, if you get the virus, that you do not mount a very serious case of COVID that could potentially end in mortality. And that's why what we need to do right now, again, not some people watching this might have a totally not agree with me at all, but really prioritizing those people that are most vulnerable. Who are these people? The elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. And then I guess like the other subset are those that are going to be most in contact with the virus. And so for some of us who are not having pre-existing conditions, are younger, are just working from home, though yes, I think some people would love to get the vaccine for different reasons, we really do need to prioritize those that really need the vaccine first. And when it comes to distribution, I mean, the unfortunate reality is like we have what we have. And as much as like it sometimes can feel unfair, but we have to sort of, I think it kind of boils down to not being selfish and really, again, like prioritizing those people that really need the vaccine to make sure that they get protected first. And again, as the research stands now, and of course, like more will be revealed later, it really doesn't seem that the vaccine is much about the prevention of the spread. Again, this is based on just the limited what I'm even aware of, that is really there to make sure that if one were to get the virus, that they do not fall gravely ill and potentially pass away from the virus. And again, so we really need to protect those that are the most vulnerable. It's very similar. Again, we have to be careful of not necessarily comparing COVID to the flu, but even when we think about something like the flu, the recommendation is always that those that are more vulnerable tend to necessitate getting the vaccine more than those that aren't. So that is sort of my stance as it is today. And today is the 5th of March. We have no idea what the 6th of March will say. And so all I can state is what I know now.
We're approaching the Ides of March.
Oh, interesting.
But having worked with vaccines in the vaccine industry, Ivy, does the fact that there was no animal testing, right, of these vaccines, can you comment to that? Is that something we should be concerned about? Is that something you're concerned about?
Right, and again, I mean, I have to say for the record, like I'm definitely not anti-vaccine, and we have to kind of, I mean, it's just like anything. What I forget, like you probably the what is it called, like the rules of three, and this idea of again like how long a drug has been on the market. And I mean, for my own person, I mean, again, because of the way New York works, I mean, I'm not, even if I wanted to get the vaccine, I wouldn't have that liberty until the summer. My personal opinion for myself is I'm still undecided. I mean, it's nice to have, at least by the time I'm even eligible to get the vaccine, at least will be a few more months of how are people reacting and how effective this vaccine is. But yes, I mean, there's still so much. I mean, I hate to say that, like, humans are going to be like the best guinea pig in this situation, but like, only time really can tell.
Right. And, yeah.
Yeah.
Ivy, this has been great, and I would love to ask you some more questions, but I know you have a patient coming.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so is there anything else you would like to add? Any other message you would like to give our viewers?
I mean, I think it's like kind of just continuously repetition, but really, I'm hoping that, yes, it's so great that we have this vaccine, but what I really, really hope that this is a big eye opener for everyone to really just take one really good care of yourself. Like really make that a priority. I mean, one, no matter what, well, my gosh, I mean, I feel like there's a whole other philosophical argument, but like if this is your one life, you really want to treasure that. And you really want to also treasure your relationships. And I mean, some of my little, when I think about like that last week before the pandemic, I actually saw a show on Broadway, a play. You know, if I had known that that was going to be the last play I would see in over a year, I think I would have paid a lot more attention. I think I would have been a lot more engaged and present and not. And so really one, you know, take care of yourself, really value the people in your life, finding as much joy that you can in even in the very mundane, just like taking it in, like taking every single, I was doing this thing called a breath circle early on in the pandemic, but like one of my hopes is really just allowing people to just really be enjoy and being in the present moment because it's all we have. It really is.
Oh, Ivy, I think your last words there will resonate with so many of our viewers. And I think that we truly don't realize what is important to us or what we truly value until it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully we will regain. But I think there's been valuable lessons here for everyone all the way around, not the least of which is what you just mentioned. So with that, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ivy Branin, naturopath and founder of Simplicity Health Associates and author of the blog of the same name from New York City. We wish you all the best in your practice, and I'd love the chance to catch up with you again, interview you again. Now, your website is simplicityhealthassociates.com. Is that correct?
It is correct.
Are there any other websites or any other social media you would like our viewers to be aware of?
Sure, absolutely. So you can follow me on Instagram. It's Dr. Ivy Branin on Instagram. And then on Facebook, I think it's just Dr. Ivy MD. But everything is also, when in doubt, you can always go to my website and access all my social media links. And my Instagram is very active. And I do kind of similar to Dr. Sam, I do interviews anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week with my favorite wellness practitioners of all different modalities and lots of really fun topics that we'll be covering. Yes.
Yeah, I would encourage our viewers to check that out. So once again, Ivy, thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to sign off for us here. Dr. Sam Dubé for Dr. Ivy Branin and the Toronto Business Journal. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Stay safe.